Good morning. Somehow 2018 was only 3 years ago. Obviously, a lot has changed since then, but the impetus for the 2018 Knowledge Challenge is still important. The 2018 Knowledge Challenge grants supported projects to answer specific problems for entrepreneurs and organizations or institutions supporting them. There were 4 focus areas: the new nature of entrepreneurship projects to explore how new markets are emerging and test new program designs; barriers to entrepreneurship projects to understand the barriers to entrepreneurship and where they come from; program design and policy intervention and implementation projects to show how policy outcomes affect entrepreneurs; ecosystem and external environment for entrepreneurship projects to look at how ecosystems operate. Today, we will have a chance to learn more about projects in these areas. Our time with each project will be limited to 10 minutes, but I hope that these presentations spark new ideas and new connections for our attendees. I thank you so much for joining us. I'm also thankful and appreciative of our grantees for the work they have done and continue to do, and for joining us today to share about their work. We host this showcase to provide a platform for an in-depth discussion and how to solve problems, and the Kauffman Foundation does not take a political position or legislative position on these discussions. I'm looking very much forward to today's conversation. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Misra Tihik, Entrepreneurship Research Fellow, Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University.
I'll take it from here and present our project. So Adam, please take it from here. Thank you.
Mirza, thank you. As Mirza said, we are here from Syracuse University, the Institute for Veterans and Military Families, and Mirza is affiliated with the Whitman School of Management here at SU. And we're going to tell you a little bit today about the National Survey of Military Affiliated Entrepreneurs. There's a lot that can be said about military affiliated entrepreneurs. What we know is that there are several successful people who were veterans who started very, very high profile companies. Here's a list of a few of those. And so we know that the veterans are involved in entrepreneurship, and when they do it, they do a very good job. When you think about the entrepreneurship landscape, there's a little bit of information that we can gather from the SBA and other types of sources. What this data tells us is that about 1 in 10 business owners in the United States are veterans. And veterans tend to be small business owners a lot more frequently than the general population. Excuse me, veteran-owned businesses generate about $1 trillion in the economy. They employ nearly 6 million Americans. And most of those entrepreneurs cite the military as something that gave them the skills to not only pursue entrepreneurship, but to be successful when they did so. So historically, veterans have participated in entrepreneurship far more at far higher rates than the general population. However, over the last several years, 10 to 15 years, this percentage has been declining. So if you look like in 2005, 15% of veterans compared to 11% of non-veterans were entrepreneurs. But as we come further and further along, that gap has closed. And now we see basically entrepreneurship rates for veterans roughly equivalent to non-veterans. And so this is something that we want to be aware of and want to recognize, because we believe that the history of veterans as entrepreneurs shows that veterans have traditionally been more likely to be entrepreneurs. And so the data that we have here doesn't really tell us necessarily what we need to know in order to understand why this gap is closing and what are the barriers that veteran entrepreneurs are facing. So that's where our study, the National Survey of Military Affiliated Entrepreneurs, comes into play. With support from the Kauffman Foundation, we wanted to generate some data that would allow us to better understand the experiences of veteran entrepreneurs. What are their barriers? What are their motivations? What are the things that help them to be successful as entrepreneurs? This data would go in depth beyond the information that currently exists. So if we look at existing data sources, we believe there are a lot of limitations and a lot of missed opportunities to really understand the unique needs and experiences of a veteran population. For example, a lot of the research on veteran entrepreneurs focus very narrowly on specific aspects of veteran ownership. They tend to be small studies, and one of the issues is that a lot of people studying entrepreneurship that includes veterans may not have an in-depth understanding of the veteran population as a unique population. and instead it's sort of one variable among many, rather than understanding that the experience of a veteran is very, very different from a lot of the population for a lot of reasons in terms of the skills they bring and the experiences they have coming into the entrepreneurship space. At the same time, they may be facing military transition issues as they transition out of the service back into civilian life, and everything in between. So another issue here is that we wanted to address was that essentially it's hard to gather data from people, especially business owners who have a lot going on. And so what it takes is a really intentional, deliberate approach to get people to participate in this data. And this data is usually collected one time only, sort of a snapshot. What we wanted to make sure we did was take a look at the experience of veterans, close these gaps, find a focused sample. We wanted to have a large representative population of veterans from across the country in different points in time with different needs and different reasons, and be able to differentiate that and understand that. We wanted to recognize sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought here. We want to be able to also collect information over time that would allow us to assess this project.
Yeah, really quickly, yeah. The one thing that I wanted to add is, we do rely on federal existing data sets. The census data does give us a really good snapshot of trying to understand, especially the veteran self-employment rates and business ownership and how that compares to non-veteran. But one thing in particular, because it is a subpopulation, the sample is getting smaller and smaller. And we wanted to design a survey that not only, complements federal existing data sources, but fills in that gap a little bit. So we weren't looking at replacing the data set. We were looking at filling in the gaps of trying to understand in particular why, for example, we're seeing declines in overall rates, why, for example, transition, what sort of, what's that activity look like, especially after separation and so forth and so on. So I just wanted to make that little comment there. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rosie. As Rosie said, our aim was to fill in the gaps. We wanted to be able to also, while we were doing this, to track the experiences of veterans and military spouse entrepreneurs over time. So this study also has a longitudinal component built in, and that allows us to take a look at more timely issues that come up within the veteran entrepreneur space. So as we do this, we sort of look at a cluster of things. We say, well, we believe there are variables that are specific to the military connected entrepreneur community. We want to understand the entrepreneurial ecosystem in which they're operating, both locally, nationally, and unique to veterans. There are many programs, as you know, that support veteran small businesses specifically. We wanted to be able to continue to track this information over time, generate not only snapshot data that's clear and comprehensive, that tries to address some of the issues that are not existing in the data or in the literature, but also be able to try to do this in a way that was longitudinal, and ultimately with the goal of creating a public data set that we can share with other researchers, that we can share with programs, like some of the programs we run here for entrepreneurs who are veterans, and to be able to make this information public and available to others who are making decisions about how they can best support veteran entrepreneurs. So essentially, this project is a 3-year initiative, again, supported by the Kauffman Foundation. What we wanted to do was take a look at entrepreneurs from all parts of the military community. So we wanted to look at transitioning service members, people who were about to leave the service and were thinking about starting businesses, or maybe had the beginnings of a business. We wanted to look at veterans and retirees, and we also wanted to look at military spouses who may themselves be entrepreneurs by necessity or aspiring to do so. We also wanted to look at the range of where people were in the business cycle and understand how that intersected with their military experience. So we wanted to look at specifically different questions we asked to aspiring entrepreneurs, people who were current business owners, and then many who were former business owners, to ask them about how their military experience ultimately played out as part of their business owner experience. So we asked a range of questions that asked about individual level experiences, from their service experience to disabilities, to their family, to their health, to their communities. We asked questions specific to their businesses, what types of businesses they had, how many employees did they have, what sectors were they in. And then understanding the infrastructure. And, were they able to secure funding? Where did they secure funding? Did they have support from local chambers of commerce? Things like that. And so we looked at a range of variables that were both ecological, individual, and community oriented. And this took place, is planned to take place over 3 years. And so we've gone through the first 2 of these 3 waves. So in the survey itself in 2020, we started out with 2,534 veterans who were currently business owners. You see the total sample is about 29, 25. And then you can see down here at the bottom, I won't spend too much time on these statistics. It was a pretty large sample, representative of mostly veterans and retirees, but a pretty good size sample of spouses and active duty participants. Our second year, we followed up. We have a slightly smaller sample, as you might expect, in a follow-up year. But one thing we were able to do was to take a look at, you can see the proportions are roughly similar year over year. So that means we've got a good sample for comparison purposes. But we were also able to track 429 individuals who were veterans who own businesses over time, and then 200 individuals who are retirees. So we have a sample that is longitudinal, that is about 600, so roughly half of this sample are individuals who participated in last year. So we'll be able to generate a very robust longitudinal analysis as we proceed. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rosie, and she can tell you a little bit about what we've done with the first set of data.
Yeah, so next slide, please. Yeah, so I know we're short on time, but especially after the first year, we've released several different briefs, data briefs in particular about the results of it. I'm only going to talk about very little about a few of them. I wanted to showcase them in particular, but ultimately what I wanted to display is that we've taken this data set and produced it and certainly sliced and diced it in various ways, because ultimately one of our goals was to understand entrepreneurship or military affiliated entrepreneurship, but there is such a huge diversity within the veteran population as well that we wanted to take the subsets of those data and be informed a little bit more. So we had, for the first year, I think we had over 210 questions. I think Adam had the sample size, it was over 2,500 respondents. We did choose for methods reason to only report on veteran entrepreneurs. We will be working on military spouses and other things as the sample size increases, but definitely that. So a few key highlights, the top motivations for entrepreneurship, making your own decisions, the chance to implement your own ideas, but the top barriers in particular, and I think this is no different from entrepreneurs in general, was lack of capital. And because we fielded during COVID, we started in February and ended in July, we do get a little bit of irregular income, and certainly economic situation has certainly been a top challenge or barrier at that time. Next slide, and we're going to be cut off really quickly. So next slide really quickly. I just wanted to put a brief that we also did a Black and veteran or Black veteran business owners data brief. Next slide. And a women veteran data brief. Next slide. And then everything will be on our website, and there is a link, and I appreciate it. And thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. And yeah, certainly a lot there to look at offline. So I encourage our audience to make sure to check out the research in more detail. So next up, we have Professor Rajri Agarwal, Lamone Chair of Strategy and Entrepreneurship, Director Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets, University of Maryland. Rajri?
Okay, well, thank you very much to the Kauffman Foundation, A, for supporting the grant, and then B, for providing us a forum in which we can share some of these findings. It was really interesting to see and hear Merrick and your team present on the veteran entrepreneurs. Really, really cool survey too. So, it was interesting to me that not many people knew that October 28th was National Immigrants Day. This was actually proclaimed in 1987. And in the signing of the National Immigrants Day, Ronald Reagan made the point that immigrants have always brought great gifts to their new home on these shores. The gifts of hardiness and heart, of intellect and hope. And I particularly want to draw on the fact that it's not just their talent, their intellect that immigrants often bring to the United States, but it's also the hardiness, heart, and hope, which gets to the motivations and preferences, something that we will be looking at a little bit more in the study. So our paper, supported by the Kauffman Foundation, one of the first in the series, is why are immigrants disproportionately more likely to start high growth startups? And what we do is rely on the National Science Foundation survey of US university graduates who joined the STEM workforce in the United States. This is joint work with Martin Genko at University of Wisconsin and Joe Raffi, who is at the University of Southern California. So of course, if you look at the models, generally speaking, of why people engage in entrepreneurship, going back, of course, to what Ronald Reagan said in his quote, first of all, they may have the relevant skills and human capital as it relates to intellect and aptitudes. But then also there are the preferences for entrepreneurship that combine together with the relevant skills in human capital. And models have shown that both of these are equally important in determining who chooses to engage in new venture creation. Now here, there's a related literature that also talks about the fact that, you know, when human capital is often defined, starting from Gary Becker, as human capital acquired through either education or through job experience. And so particularly relevant out here is what happens when you also get your job experience is very closely related to your education. So you're really, really getting specialized skills and human capital in a particular domain of knowledge. Now, generally speaking, one of the things that we find is that in this original model of entrepreneurship, if you're immigration constrained, you cannot engage in entrepreneurship given our current laws on immigration and the constraints that it imposes. In fact, not only can you not engage in entrepreneurship, you also have to, through the optional practical training, you are sorted into jobs that are highly relevant to your education, because this is about practical training in the area that you have just received your education. So generally speaking, if individuals have preferences for entrepreneurship and they're unconstrained, you tend to see, and again, research has shown this in the past, that you're less likely to sort into job education match. You're going to have these more generalized skills and engage in entrepreneurship right off the start. So what you end up seeing is that immigration constraints suppress this early career entrepreneurship, and in addition, force people to sort into job education match itself. So right off the bat, and of course in our data, what we do is compare not just immigrants that are work constrained, but against natives, but also other immigrants who may already, through other reasons, through family sponsorship or other asylum reasons, have already received their green card. So we can actually compare all kinds of people that are graduating from the universities to see what they're doing in terms of their sorting. So one of the key findings that we have right off the bat is not only do work-constrained immigrants sort into job education match, they are actually earning less and reporting lower job satisfaction relative to natives. And part of this we attribute to the fact that they find themselves very constrained given the immigration rules out here. Now, again, related literature has said that if you're unconstrained, generally speaking, and you have a high job education match, you have highly specialized human capital, these individuals are also the ones that experience higher opportunity costs in terms of their wages. And so they're less likely to engage in entrepreneurship later on in their career. Now, we find that this is very true for unconstrained people, but our hypotheses, which we, of course, I'm going to show you the results in a second too, is showing that this relationship is dampened for individuals that have a release of immigration constraints. So, after they get a green card, they are able to exercise their preferences for entrepreneurship that they couldn't before. And because they have these highly specialized skills and high opportunity costs, one of the things that we hypothesize is that they're less likely to go into unincorporated entrepreneurship and much, much more likely to go into incorporated entrepreneurship, which is associated with higher growth as well as more job creation in the first place. And indeed, what we see is exactly that, in that our match based on the prior survey of those that had job education match, you see that they're much, much more likely to engage in high growth entrepreneurship too, once their immigration constraints have been released. So what does this mean for policy? On the one hand, you could say that the results are positive because immigration constraints cause individuals to sort into job education match. That allows them to acquire specialized skills, and then they can then engage in the high growth entrepreneurship later in their career. And as a result, the US economy benefits too. But we believe that these results actually show a negative or a suppressing effect. So first off, because it suppresses early career entrepreneurship, it causes extensive delay in us reaping the rewards of high entrepreneur, their preferences as well as their STEM education. And more importantly, some immigrants choose to leave for other countries. And you're seeing this more and more happen, particularly because other countries are much, much more welcoming and have become a host of much of the high growth entrepreneurship too. We showed that there are reduced benefits in terms of job education match, in terms of both salary and job satisfaction. So at the individual level, these constraints are not necessarily increasing social welfare, if you will. But most importantly, we believe that creating delays in the formation of high growth startups is really negative for the US economy. And particularly anecdotal evidence shows that sometimes people have to wait for a very, very long time for their green card because of, maybe the country that they come from, and there are these caps imposed on country level quotas, if you will. So there's an excess supply versus demand, and that can cause lower rates of incorporated entrepreneurship. I know that one of my executive MBA cohort executives who was waiting for a green card once said to me that he has a stronger hope of getting a green card once his son, who was born here after they came to this country, turns 21 and can sponsor them on a family level green card than he can through a work-related green card sponsorship. So all of this, along with other related recent research, has also caused us through this Kauffman grant to create a policy brief that is based on not just this research, where what we say is it's time for policy to be reformed again and perhaps go back to the pro-immigration sentiment that was very prevalent in this country as recently as in the 1980s and 90s. So reform optional practical training permit rules so that you have more work-related flexibility and remove employee sponsorship requirements. This will not suppress early career entrepreneurship, as we find it to be the case. Maybe one of the other things that we can really work on doing is reducing immigration paperwork burden and raising visa caps. So this will reduce offshoring of jobs to other countries like Canada, as Britta Glennon finds in her research that has been NBER working paper. relax stringent visa requirements that reduce global mobility and cross-border acquisitions. This will allow complementarities to bloom between both migrants and locals, as opposed to thinking that they're really taking jobs off. There is no evidence for it. And of course, across countries too. And this is substantiated by research done by Raj Chaudhary at Harvard, by Z. Kanandis at Wharton, and Sarath Balachandran in London Business School, as well as Dan Wang, if I remember right, Derek. Dan was also a Kauffman Foundation dissertation fellowship winner. And then finally, establish visa programs that allow for startups and entrepreneurial activity so that it will speed up high growth entrepreneurship by skilled workers, as both us and Raj Chaudhary talk about. So again, I'll end with the fact that we as a country are definitely one that have been always welcoming of immigrants. In that Congress affirmation, we're the sons and daughters of every land across the face of the earth, and yet we are an indivisible nation. So hopefully we will have Congress pay attention to this and do the much needed policy reform. I know that Kauffman Foundation is very, very supportive of these kinds of policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajri. Just as a reminder to our audience to use the Q&A function, we will be short on time, so we may not have time at the end of today's presentations for a formal Q&A, but we can certainly take questions in the Q&A function here in Zoom. Now we'll be turning over to Professor Mark Curtis, Wake Forest University.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you so much for having me into Kauffman for the support for this project. So this paper is joint with Dan Garrett, who was a PhD student at Duke and is now at Wharton, with Eric Orn, Kevin Roberts, who is on the call, so you can ask him questions, and Juan Carlos Suarez Serrato. This is a paper that uses confidential census data to answer questions about how about the effects of a particular tax policy on the economy. So what we're going to look at here is a policy called bonus depreciation, and I thought it was interesting from the survey that we heard about from military entrepreneurs that the primary barrier to entrepreneurship was access to capital. And so what we're going to look at here is one particular policy which may affect access to capital, and we're going to look at how it affects a number of economic outcomes. So the policy that we're going to look at here is called bonus depreciation, and it's a federal tax policy that allows for firms to immediately deduct a large portion of their investment cost from their taxable income. So as a result of bonus, which I'll call it, this is going to reduce the effective cost of capital, and it's going to incentivize investment. And the policy that we're going to look at, the particular bonus policy that we're going to look at, is one that happened in 2001 and was part of one of the largest incentives ever for capital investment in US history. And this is this idea of bonus depreciation, the idea that you can, that the federal government can essentially incentivize investment by allowing firms to immediately write off the cost of their capital, is one that continues to be a major policy idea in the United States. So it was a major component of the 2017 tax bill. And this particular component of the tax bill is going to cost over $300 billion over the next 5 years. So this is a big policy really intended to incentivize investment. So what we're going to do with this paper, we are going to ask, does this policy in fact stimulate investment? That's going to be a first order question. We're going to ask which firms specifically are going to benefit from this policy, which workers are going to benefit, and then we're going to ask kind of some bigger picture questions, right? So there's been some concerns that if firms do a lot of investment in new capital, that might eliminate human work, that you might have capital that substitute for labor. So we're going to ask what this policy can tell us about some of these deeper questions about the relationship between capital investment and workers and labor demand. Okay. So the approach that we're going to take is we're going to take confidential plant level data, manufacturing plant data from the United States Census. We're going to be able to identify a number of characteristics about the firm. We're going to be able to see, not only the industry, we're going to be able to observe firm age, size, we're going to be able to observe the types of workers that they're employing, and lots about their inputs and their outputs. And we're going to use tax variation that comes from this bonus depreciation policy. Okay, so we're going to essentially compare plants that are in industries that have long-lived capital and are really going to benefit from this bonus depreciation policy with other plants that don't use long-lived capital and are not going to benefit. So the plants that are going to benefit most from this policy are ones that have long-lived capital. So previously they had to wait a really long time to write off their investment expenses. But with bonus depreciation, now they can write it off immediately. So we're going to compare those plants with plants that are in other firms who could already essentially write off most of the cost of their investment immediately. So that's going to be kind of our identification strategy for this paper. Okay? And what's nice is that the variation that we're exploiting is really based on pretty much arbitrary IRS capital appreciation schedules that are from decades ago. And so the IRS decades ago said that some capital should depreciate at this rate, other capital should depreciate at this rate. So we're taking that kind of historical arbitrariness that the IRS set to identify the effect of new investment on firms and workers. Okay, so we're gonna use an event study, a diff and diff event study. We'll have data back to 1997. We'll look through 2001. And we're going to estimate the effect of this policy on investment, capital, output, total factor productivity, earnings, employment by a number of different demographic groups, which you'll see there. And then after we obtain these estimates of the effect of this policy on these firms, then we're going to take these estimates, we're going to plug them into a structural model to tell us something more fundamental about the relationship between capital and labor. Okay. So I'm just going to run straight to the results right here. Okay, so this is the policy hits in 2001, and we observe that as soon after 2001, really right off the bat, we see a big increase in plants investments for the plants that were most affected by bonus depreciation, the plants that most benefited from the lowering in the cost of capital. We also see a pretty dramatic increase in the capital stock of these plants that were most affected. Okay, so the investment effects were something around 15%. The overall capital effect is something around 8 or 9% as a result of this policy. Interestingly, so we can also look at employment. So what did this do to employment in plants? And we see that there is an increase in employment of around 10% following this tax policy. Okay? And we see even larger effects for workers that are interacting with this new equipment, right? So production line workers, we see even larger effects, employment effects. We can also look at this, so we can really break this down and try to understand what types of firms are benefiting. And what's really interesting is that we see the largest, if you look on the right, we see the largest effect for youngest firms, right? So we see about a 20% increase in employment in young firms as a result of this policy. Small firms are also seeing a benefit. So, when we think about investment policies, tax policies that potentially stimulate entrepreneurship, this seems like it could be doing just that. All right, so we're going to think more about kind of the worker what this does to the worker composition of firms. Interestingly, we don't see a big effect of this policy on worker earnings. So stimulating investment does not seem to have a big effect on earnings. And the reason for this, we believe, is that it is when firms invest in capital, it appears that they're fundamentally changing the composition of their workforce. And so what happens is that we see increases in affected plants of workers that have a high school degree or less, so less educated workers make up a larger percentage of the workforce of the affected plants. Younger workers are also appear to be hired as a result of this policy. And as do minorities. So Blacks and Hispanics see a larger increase in employment as a result of this policy. And as do females. Okay, so I kind of rushed through some of that there, but the overall, the overall takeaways when we look at this policy is that we see investment increase by 15%, suggesting that it is lowering a barrier to capital. We see a larger effect for new firms than we do for overall firms. We see interestingly, we see an employment increase of 10%. So it does not appear that this capital is replacing workers. It appears that there is actually, workers are actually, employment is actually complementing this new capital, and that traditionally disadvantaged workers appear to be benefiting the most. And that we don't see any any increase in productivity growth. We also don't see any increase in average worker earnings. And the structural model that we use, which I'm obviously not going to get into right now, really do suggest, the results from that model really do suggest that capital and labor are not in fact substitutes, that they are in fact complements. And it really does, our results seem to rule out the worst fears that people have had about this policy. That machines are just going to replace workers. So that's all I've got. Thank you for letting me present.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate it. And really interesting results. Thank you for sharing with us today. Moving right along, we'll be turning to Dr. Tammy Hurley, Associate Professor and PhD Program Director, University of Kansas Medical Center. Tammy, when you're ready, please take it away.
Great, thank you so much. This is a great way to start the day, learning about all of these different projects. I do love talking about tax policy, but today I'm going to kind of switch directions. And this is a project that's probably a little personal in nature. So a group of my colleagues and I, so Jess Williams, Joanna Brooks, Dorothy Hughes, and I, as we kind of navigate family and career, are thinking about this in the terms, in the context of entrepreneurship. And in our, the place where we decided to focus first, although there's so many questions, is in thinking about women who might be prone to high growth entrepreneurship or high tech entrepreneurship, and how do they navigate these issues of family. And family could be children, it could be caring for elderly parents, it could be any number of things. And so we're going to have a pretty narrow focus in the work that I present you today, but I think that there's so much to be done and to understand. The work that I'm presenting today is largely exploratory in nature. I don't think that we really thought we knew what questions to ask even, but just to kind of start exploring what themes are out there. And so, the concern that we had is, as women navigate these issues, does that affect the pool of entrepreneurs that we get or the innovation that we get? Are we missing out on some innovative entrepreneurship because people are in these seasons of life that are very stressful, and there are social constructs that put pressure on people, and also what kind of supports do we provide? And as you know, in the US, we have maybe less generous family support policies than other places, say in Europe. And then COVID-19 has impacted this project in some very real ways. The first being that at the medical center, as an economist at the medical center, I've found myself being tapped to be the COVID forecaster for the state of Kansas. And so that was a little disruptive to research in general. But then in the broader world, in the COVID environment, we've seen, disruptions to the childcare market, and how much of that is a disruption in supply in terms of you can't hire workers, how much of that is a disruption in demand. People are working from home in certain occupations, but not in others. And so COVID is a whole new environment to understand the context of these factors in. So, overall, as motivation, we think of economic growth and prosperity as being tied to innovation and entrepreneurship, but we think that these, our hypothesis is that these family factors, like things like policy, depreciation policy, or other things that we might do, also make a big impact on who undertakes entrepreneurial activities. And so, we see from time use data that the self-employed women's time use patterns are clearly different than any other category, whether that's wage and salary employed women or wage and salary employed men or self-employed men. They spend a lot more time in what we call secondary childcare. So being there with your children, although your primary function is not caring for the children at that time. And then, there's the whole issue of cultural norms and this idea of a second shift where women still bear more of the burden for the unpaid household work. And then in the entrepreneurship literature, kind of two branches where women choose entrepreneurship maybe for lifestyle factors and that they can be closer to their children, they have more flexible schedules. But then there's another branch that says some women might be looking for earnings and growth potential. And so part of the reason we wanted to focus on women is they're a growing part of the pool of potential innovators. So they earn more professional degrees than men. They do earn fewer professional degrees in science and engineering, but their growth rate of degrees in those areas is growing faster than that of men, at least at the moment. So that is converging. So to look at this, to start exploring this, we started with the NLSY 79 data, the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. And in the end, you have to decide how to measure things, right? And so entrepreneurship we're measuring as experience with self-employment. To find the likely innovators, we are looking at women with professional degrees. And then in terms of family factors, we're looking at fertility. So when did you have your first child generally? Although we have a lot of information in this data set about family factors and how they change over time. And we took a mixed methods approach. We also talked to 4 women entrepreneurs, purposefully sampled from our professional networks. And then we just interviewed until we had a wide range of themes for preliminary findings. So I'll talk about themes from the data first, and I'm going to talk fast because I think I'm probably going to run out of time here. But so the overall theme from the data was that women with professional degrees have similar patterns, whether they're self-employed or not. So these patterns of fertility really seem to be related to their kind of education path more than their particular career path. And so that'll be interesting to keep in mind as we look at labor markets going forward. The women with the professional degrees were least likely to have their expected number of children, and they were older at first marriage and first child. So if you look at the data overall, self-employment for women looks very family friendly. They're more likely to have children, they have more children overall. But you see this bigger gap, that pattern doesn't hold for professional women. And for professional women, you see this bigger gap between the number of children they expected to have when they were younger and the number of children they actually had in life. And so in trying to sort out whether this is a problem or this is just change in preferences over time, I'm going to show you some pictures about children. So here's ever had a child, and on the left you have women who are self-employed, and on the right you have women who are never self-employed. And so we see higher probabilities of ever having a child among the self-employed women, and you see the highest probability among women with a professional degree who are self-employed. So that may suggest that maybe they are achieving their family goals. When you look at total number of children, the most is among self-employed women who don't have professional degrees, and then it just decreases down at the least among not self-employed women who have a professional degree. But this one is interesting. This is a difference between the number of children they expected to have in life, and I'll talk about when they answered that question, and the number of children that they actually had. So overall, women with professional degrees have fewer children than they started out expecting to have. And from a society perspective, then are we, I don't know, how do we help people achieve excellence in their career and excellence in their family? And I think those are open questions going forward. And so I'll tell you just a little bit about where we're going with the data. So we're looking a lot more about patterns, timing, using survival analysis. So if you have a child young, then what's the probability of becoming self-employed, and when does that happen? We have some data that we think are good instruments. We might be able to instrument for number of children. So participants were 14 to 21 in 1979 when they first started taking the survey. And in 1979 and in 1982, they answered a series of questions about their desired, ideal, and expected number of children. And then we might be able to use those to instrument for the actual number of children later on. And so isolating the variation from those early expected outcomes to identify the effects of family factors on whether you become self-employed. So quickly, some results from the qualitative analysis. So these are fascinating. As an economist, I didn't collect this data, I'll be honest about that. So the decisions are multifactorial. They're structural and based on the industry that a person is in, industry norms around hours, when and where you work, although COVID might have disrupted some of those norms. Some of them are interpersonal, just perceiving that bosses are unsupportive of family and unsupportive of careers. A lot of factors that push people toward entrepreneurship were gendered perceptions, or they faced a lot of gendered perceptions when they started going to entrepreneurship, and that people assumed that this was just going to be a side hustle. It wasn't actually going to be their main job. And so people would refer to their work as the mommy track. And so I think women who enter entrepreneurship for growth and innovation face some of these ideas in society that they're really not serious about what they're doing. And their perceptions were that men didn't encounter these same perceptions. We found from talking to the women that family leave policies impact both their fertility decisions and their decisions to become self-employed. But an interesting thing was these women also expressed a desire to want to know how to support their employees. They weren't sure how to do it, right? So they had lived it, but they wanted more information on how they could support their employees going forward and balancing these family and career decisions. So push factors from jobs, perceptions of unequal pay, low growth potential, and gender discrimination. So one of our participants said, it was so clear and obvious to me that I wasn't working for someone who was even going to help me find ways to continue to grow. They said, you are poised to grow, you have the skills to grow, but I don't have a way to make it happen for you. And so that was clear to her at that point that she had to do something different. Pull factors for these women, it was an internal drive to build a business. Now these were women who had families, but their main pull factor into entrepreneurship was not the lifestyle. It was really about career and building a business. In all cases, starting the business was a well thought out decision. And one thing that's interesting, and I'd be really interested in this audience to get more perspectives on this, is they struggled with this entrepreneurial identity, like when they could claim that. Were they successful enough to claim it? And then all the energy that they expended trying to explain the role that this business played in their life to people who assumed that it was probably something that wasn't very serious. And so one of our participants said, the difference is my business is not optional. The income we get from my business allows us to pay for childcare bills. It allows us to pay for our house. It's very full-time. I envision my role as an entrepreneur as a full-time role. So for them, that was kind of the definition, is this something that is my full-time job and that is essential to our family to pay the bills? And that is all I have today.
Thank you so much, Tammy. When I think about your work, I think about the importance of those gender perceptions of just using the word entrepreneur. When you use the word entrepreneur, people will have a very different view of what that means if they think about a female versus a male entrepreneur. And I think about that a lot, just the language we use, how that can be affected. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And as a reminder to the audience to use the Q&A for questions that you may have with any of our presenters, as we will probably not have time for a formal Q&A session at the end. Next up, we have Dr. Jin Hong, Professor of Social Work, St. Louis University, Research Associate Professor, Washington University in St. Louis.
Thank you, Derek. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to share our study on financial capability of low-income entrepreneurs here. So, okay. It's great to hear a lot of programs and studies here this morning. So we already learned the programs on veterans and immigrants and women. So in our study, we are going to focus on low-income individuals. And I would like to thank Kauffman Foundation for the support and the opportunity. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Margaret Schraden and Baorong Guo, for working with me together on this project. Okay, as social workers, we see entrepreneurship has a great potential, and also it's a very important avenue for low-income individuals and families to achieve their economic development and self-sufficiency. But low-income individuals face a variety of challenges to pursue and sustain entrepreneurship, such as lack of education, skills, capital, social contacts, and poor infrastructures and financial services in the low-income areas. Even so, when we compare across several micro data sets, the 2016 National Financial Wellbeing Survey, the 2018 National Financial Capability Survey, and the 2019 Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making, the self-employment rate. So we use the same measure like Dr. Curry here, like the self-employment rate among low-income individuals, it's almost the same and even higher than that for the higher income individuals. So here is the question we really try to figure out is, so what can we do to promote entrepreneurship among low-income individuals, especially for our social workers? We work in frontline on a variety of financial issues with low-income families, and we already have established this trust relationship with the community. And we would like to explore how social workers can better support this ecosystem to support entrepreneurship among low-income individuals. Okay, so we all know that the lack of wealth and the credit often present a barrier to entrepreneurship for low-income population, but we think the focus on credit may be too narrow. So we expand the concept and propose a financial capability approach to entrepreneurship. And financial capability includes individual ability, such as financial literacy, financial knowledge, and financial skills. And it also includes individuals' external environment, providing financial opportunities, services, and access. So we combine both individual abilities and environmental access. Entrepreneurs can have the financial capability to achieve financial resilience and success and financial well-being. So in fact, the rescue programs during the COVID also show the importance of building financial capability and resilience among the entrepreneurs. Now we argue that this financial capability approach, this financial capability process should target all individuals, not just for entrepreneurs, and should be across the whole life cycle. Why? Because if people do not have financial capability, they will not establish this entrepreneurship cognition, and they will never ever think about creating or initiating entrepreneurship in the future. And so the credit intervention, typically we see the credit intervention at the time of entrepreneurship initiation, we think it's already too late. It's kind of like the student loan at the time of college admission. So we already miss many potential entrepreneurs here. Okay, so essentially, we think this financial capability approach is consistent with a more general network of entrepreneurship. We can think financial knowledge and skills as one individual ability, and financial access, financial inclusion as one environmental factor. And financial capability approach provides a cross-sectional view of this framework on finance specifically. Then what's the financial capability status of low-income entrepreneurs? We use the 2016 National Financial Wellbeing Survey as one example here and have the cutoff line for low-income families set at the 200% poverty line. Financial knowledge. The national mean on this scale is negative 0.18. And low-income entrepreneurs have the lowest level of financial knowledge, even lower than low-income non-entrepreneurs. And the difference between low-income and higher-income entrepreneurs is even larger than the difference between low-income and higher-income non-entrepreneurs. So we will only present some descriptive studies, the statistics here to show the pattern due to the time concern. And you will see almost the same pattern here on another measure, financial skills. Okay, so almost same pattern. Okay, financial access. And we count 6 services of checking accounts, life insurance, health insurance, retirement savings account, pension, and other investment accounts here. Again, we see a very similar pattern here. Low-income entrepreneurs have lowest level of financial access and have a larger difference with higher income entrepreneurs. So why do low-income entrepreneurs have a low level of financial access and financial capability? Of course, there are many different reasons, market and financial services supplied. So we would like to emphasize the role of social policies in this process of financial exclusion. Let's think about retirement savings account. It's not just a market-oriented product. The nature of retirement savings account, it's a social policy sponsored by government, okay, and distributed mainly through occupational welfare system. Because of the design and the delivery of this policy, entrepreneurs, and especially low-income entrepreneurs, they are more likely to suffer from financial exclusion. They are not in this occupational welfare system. So social policy plays a key role here on promoting financial capability among low-income entrepreneurs. And our further analysis, I do not show those analyses here. So our further analysis show that low financial capability, knowledge, skill, access, and the use of alternative financial services, they are highly associated with low-income entrepreneurs' financial well-being. So how can we improve financial capability of low-income entrepreneurs and support their entrepreneurial and the financial success? So from the social workers' perspective, our social workers first think through these from a social policy perspective. So we emphasize the importance of social policy, not just small business policy, not just economic policy. We think social policy is very important here. Because of the trend of financialization of social policy, it's very hard to achieve financial inclusion only relying on the financial services in the market. Now, thinking about the tax policy, tax incentive, Dr. Curtis just mentioned that how likely that the low-income individuals and low-income families can access that. So to promote financial low-income entrepreneurs' financial opportunities, financial access, and financial inclusion, we really need to combine the social policy and efforts here. So we think the universality of financial access through social policy, through tax system, it's a key here. Okay, second, policy implications. Social workers, okay, so low-income individuals have very few opportunities to receive financial guidance services from the market, such as financial education, counseling, coaching, and even financial therapy. And social workers have unique position here because social workers are among the people and the communities. They have these natural connections and the platform to provide such services to low-income individuals and family. But they also need to receive trainings on these services. So we have been working on the financial capability trainings for social workers in last several years, both domestically and internationally, using this opportunity, using this project to improve their service competencies. So we really try to use this opportunity to include social worker as one component of this ecosystem. So that way, they can also support low-income entrepreneurs to improve their financial knowledge and the skills, their financial ability. Okay, so with that, I would like to turn this back to Derek. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Jin. Really fascinating to hear and see about the social implications. I think that the call out for the social policy is particularly relevant and important to keep in mind on that topic. I want to turn it now over to Dr. Felix Cabo, Research Faculty Institute for Social Research, University of Michigan. So Felix, when you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you, Derek. I'd first like to acknowledge my collaborators who are not here. I think Elizabeth was here, but she had to leave. Elizabeth is with the Global Institute for Experience Entrepreneurship, and Stuart is with the Ross School of Business. I'll be sharing with you some of our findings on the links between financial literacy and starting a new business and some of the differences we found between old and young entrepreneurs. I'd like to locate this work in a broader context, but first I'd like to thank the foundation for generously supporting this work through the Knowledge Challenge grant. This work is actually part of a larger program of research called the Boomers Entrepreneurship and Retirement 2030 Project, which, unsurprisingly, was started in 2016 with the help of the Kauffman Foundation. So how did we get here? So this is a highly stylized timeline, and I just focus on the data collection efforts as opposed to all project activities. So this is what we've been doing since we received the funding from the Knowledge Challenge grant. At the bottom of the timeline are the 2 waves of data we promised in the proposal, and those are the entrepreneurship surveys that we ran in 2019 and 2021. We've been collecting data using the National Representative Understanding America Study panel. And then at the top of the timeline are 2 waves of data collection that respond to a very profound and seismic shift in our world, the global pandemic. And so what happened is in early 2020, we were all sent home, working from home, all that stuff. And we realized that the pandemic was having significant impacts and disruptions on entrepreneurs and business owners. So we designed an instrument to understand what was going on with respect to how the pandemic was impacting entrepreneurs. And we did the first wave of collection, data collection in 2020. And then we just finished the second wave of data collection a few days ago. So I'll do something different. Rather than give you a standard overview of the literature, I'll sort of summarize it via our hypothesis. And what we found from the literature is that women and those racial minorities and those with lower levels of education are more likely to have lower levels of financial literacy. We also found that those who have higher levels of financial literacy are more likely to have started a new business, both in the short and long term. And then we found that even though financial literacy is important for all adults, it actually might be more salient for older adults. So our conceptual framework, time 3 is 2019, when we collected entrepreneurship data. And then time 1 is 2014, time 2 is 2016. One advantage of working with the UAS is we have access not just to the data that we've collected ourselves, but to all other UAS data. And so we're trying to understand that relationship between the demographic factors and how they're correlated with financial literacy, how that in turn shapes entrepreneurial involvement. So a bit more about the entrepreneurship data we collected. We administered it to the entire UAS panel. The UAS is a national representative panel. They use address-based sampling. It's been active since 2013. So one might ask, why are we interested in older adult entrepreneurship? And the simple answer is demographic aging. The US is aging as a nation, and this is primarily driven by the aging of the baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964. Now, there's evidence that entrepreneurship is significantly impacting work and retirement behaviors among older adults. We define this as people age 50 and above, and I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. Using the Kauffman Foundation's own data, we know that in 2013, adults ages 50 to 59 founded businesses at higher risk than those ages 18 to 29. There's also evidence from other sources that there has been a general decline in the rate of business creation for those in their 20s and 30s, but actually that rate of business creation has increased for those in the 50s and 60s. So as you can see, we had a fairly good response rate, which probably indicates the importance of this topic to the national population. We were also interested in having more ecumenical or broader definitions of who is an entrepreneur, who is involved in entrepreneurship. So in the literature, you find that it primarily boils down to self-employment or owning a business. So we do have that, whether or not you started a business, but we have other dimensions, such as did you create things for profit, regardless of what employment status you had or whether it was within the confines of organizational boundaries. We also have things that capture aspects of the informal economy, ranging from people who might be salaried, but they're doing things on the side, and then people who are doing, what you'd call gig work, Uber, Airbnb. So a quick scan, when you look at the differences between entrepreneurs and general population, and actually before I do that, I would say the reason why we use the age 50 cutoff is that is in line with the Health and Retirement Study. That's the world's premier study of aging, and it's now become a benchmark for sister studies across the globe. So back to the slide, you see that compared to the general population, entrepreneurs, at least they're older, which is not surprising that they tend to be they're more likely to be retired. The female majority is smaller, and they tend to have higher income. So then we were trying to understand differences between old and young entrepreneurs at the national level and across regions in the United States. And we say regions here to mean the standard federal regions defined by the Office of Management and Budget. What we found was that, consistently, older adults are more likely to have been involved in entrepreneurial activities than younger adults. In fact, when you look at starting a business, older adults are about twice as likely to have done that compared to younger adults. So we looked at all these factors, and we decided that we would treat chronological age as an exposure, and that's what we used to have our analysis. I would just go over this really quickly. Our dependent variable or the failure event is starting a new business in the short and long term. Our exposure is chronological age, and the main independent variable is financial literacy. So we do have the demographic covariates, but also other variables such as whether you're still working for pay. And the research questions we're interested in is whether there's a correlation between financial literacy and starting a new business, both in the short term and in the long term. So the first thing we did was to understand what are the factors that are correlated with financial literacy. And here it seems that it maps pretty well onto the existing literature. So we see that there's a race effect. There is education is correlated with that. Gender, women are more likely to have lower levels of financial literacy. Even things like the gender by race interaction, those matter. What's interesting is seeing some of the differences. So while all these factors seem to operate the same way, whether you're looking at the entire population or younger adults or older adults, you see, for example, when you look at the interaction of race and gender, the effect size is larger for older adults. And the next thing we did was to then try and understand what is the relationship between financial literacy and starting a new business. And you see that that is only significant among all the adults. And so what you can then take away from that is that financial literacy is positively and significantly associated with the risk or hazard of starting a new business. And it's a kind of weird way to say that, because typically when you see survival analysis, risk hazard in medical settings is normally a negative thing. Here it's a good thing, but it suggests that financial literacy is significantly associated with the risk or hazard of starting a new business, both in the short term and the long term, but only among older adults. So we hope that we've demonstrated the value or utility of maybe rethinking how do you approach the chronological age, treating this as an exposure to entrepreneurship. Our findings, some of them map onto the literature. So we found that women, racial minorities, and those who have lower levels of education have lower levels of financial literacy. But what we're really excited about are the findings that we unearthed with respect to older adults, where, for instance, when you look in the long term, where a 1 unit increase in financial literacy is associated with a 7% increase in the risk of starting a new business. And that is even higher in the short term, where a 1 unit increase in financial literacy among older adults is associated with a 24% increase in the risk of starting a new business. So this is a work that's ongoing, but we hope that it lends support to the idea that financial literacy programs and interventions that target older adults could have significant impacts, and not just in the short term, but likely in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you so much, as always, Felix. I think it's wonderful to see the timeline of where you've been in the project and the implications of whether or not interventions may be able to help assist is very important as next steps in terms of looking at where your work is going. So thanks again so much for sharing. Moving right along, we'll have Miss Olivia Kim, PhD candidate at MIT. So Olivia, when you're ready, please take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Kim. I am a PhD student in finance at MIT. So before I begin, I just wanted to thank the Kauffman Foundation for offering the grant and also for giving us the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I'm excited to learn about the very interesting work that all of the panelists have done. And also I'm very delighted to share some of the results that our team has worked on. So the project is titled Revenue Collapses and the Consumption of Small Business Owners in the Early Stages of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And it's a joint work with Professors Jonathan Parker and Antoinette Shore at MIT. Small business owners face high income risks due to volatile business cash flows. So how do business owners cope with these negative shocks to businesses? Business owners have much of their wealth in their own business. So the living standards of the business owners may be very sensitive to fluctuations in business performance. And this question is particularly relevant with small businesses facing unprecedented challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. They faced collapses in demand, supply chain disruptions, and some businesses, for some businesses, it was very difficult to work because of unsafe work environments. So we answered this question by using de-identified administrative data on financial accounts of small businesses and their owners from JPMorgan Chase Institute. This data was made available to us by the Institute. And as some of you may know, the Institute is a think tank that uses anonymized data on Chase customers to deliver economic analysis for the public good. The unique feature about this data and the strength of using administrative data is its high frequency and precise measurement of business performance and consumption of the business owners. So let me just dive right into how we actually use this data. So we use small business and personal checking account, debit card, credit card transactions to construct a panel data set that measures business outcomes and the consumption of the business owners. For the sample, we're going to focus on small businesses that were active before the pandemic, so in 2019, and also at the onset of the pandemic. And we're going to also restrict the sample to business owners that have a personal checking account with Chase. And so this kind of leads us to a panel data set of roughly 363,000 small businesses and their owners. We're going to focus on weekly outcomes from January to May 2020 to understand how the business performance and consumption of the business owners changed around the pandemic. And we're going to focus on 3 outcomes. We construct revenues from inflows into the business checking accounts, net of the financial inflows. So for example, if there are transfers in and out of their own personal accounts, we're going to exclude those, as well as non-business income, such as government transfers, unemployment insurance, or tax refunds. So that's our measure of revenue. For expenses, we're going to categorize all of the detailed transactions on their business checking, debit card and credit card accounts, and aggregate it up to the business. So that's how we have a very granular view of how expenses have varied, and also these individual components of the expenses. We're also going to measure consumption of the business owners in a similar fashion by identifying and by categorizing and aggregating all of the spending out of their personal financial account, and aggregating up to the owner level. Just a quick note that we actually we allow firms to exit in our sample to be able to understand just the effect, the magnitude of just the extensive margin. And we basically code, if a firm exits during our sample period, we code revenues and expenses as continuing zeros following account closures. So, okay, so this is the analysis sample. So what do we do with this data? Our first finding is that the COVID-19 pandemic had a major initial impact on small businesses. Here I'm showing you a graph that plots the evolution of year-over-year change in the revenues, weekly revenues and expenses around the timing of the declaration of the national emergency in March 2020. And you can see that both average weekly revenues and expenses relative to the year ago have declined by more than 40% since 2 months before the national emergency. And this pattern holds across different types of businesses. I'm plotting the average weekly revenues by different types of businesses, and whether it's essential business, non-essential business, small or large firms, employer, non-employer firms, we see this large drop in revenues. So what I'm not plotting here is average weekly expenses, but average weekly expenses actually tracks the revenue patterns very closely. So the way we interpret this result is that firms actually downsized their operations altogether as their revenues declined. Okay, so then this raises the question of were these declines driven by the fact that there were growing infection rates or the imposition of these non-pharmaceutical interventions? And what we find is that the vast majority of this decline is actually due to nationwide factors rather than some local variation in the infection rate or the policies. So what I'm showing you here is that local infection rates and the shelter-in-place indicator seem to have a very little direct effect when we include time-fixed effects. So when we actually, within a given week, compare firms that are highly exposed to the infection rates or experience shelter-in-place, each new case per 1,000 residents leads to only 0.6 percentage point decline in weekly business revenues. And similarly, the imposition of shelter-in-place order leads to 2.6 percentage point decline. We find a similar result when we control for industry or firm size specific time trends. So overall, this appears to tell us that most of the variation in this drop in the revenues and expenses is actually not driven by local effects, but the trend in the economy. So turning now our attention to how business owners have actually fared after the shock. So we also see a large consumption decline in consumption of the business owners, independent of their business types. So as you can see, essential and non-essential businesses, small or large firms, employer, non-employer firms have all experienced an average weekly consumption decline of about 40%. So this raises a question of whether business revenue losses are significantly passed through to the consumption of business owners. So just based on this descriptive evidence, it seems that there's almost a dollar per dollar pass through. But if we actually dig in a little bit deeper, that compares businesses that were most affected and the least affected by the pandemic, it actually appears to be the case that there are large differences in revenues, which are plotted, which are shown in blue. So the solid lines show revenues and consumption that are for the least affected industries, and the dotted lines show the most affected industries. And we find that there are large differences in revenues, but almost no difference in the consumption of the owners. In fact, when we use this instrumental variables approach, we estimate about each dollar of revenue loss leads to about 1.6 cent decline in the consumption of the owners. So then what can explain this limited pass-through from the shocks to businesses to the business owners? I think we have three suggestive evidence. So first is the liquidity of the household and the businesses entering the crisis. We find that this pass-through effect is twice as large for owners with low liquidity at the onset of the pandemic. And also, there were a lot of federal programs at the time that provided liquidity that the firms needed just to weather this storm. So for example, we find that the median account balances in both business and personal checking accounts actually remained very high at the initial early stages of the pandemic. And also the third explanation is that it's just that the pandemic also reduced demand to buy goods. So for example, household spending on travel, restaurants, and personal services also dropped dramatically after the pandemic. So to summarize, we find that small businesses and their owners experienced unprecedented disruptions of up to 40% drop in weekly revenues, expenses, and consumption. And we find that the majority of this decline is actually due to nationwide factors rather than local infections or state level policies. And we actually only find the modest impact of small business revenue losses into the owner's consumption. And of course, the implication here is that because we're only looking at the very early stages of the pandemic, this pass-through effect may rise over time as the pandemic unfolds. Okay. Thank you. This is all I have.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I really appreciated the breakdown too of seeing like the difference by the least affected and most affected industries. And it's certainly top of mind for everybody to think about the structural changes and long-term consequences of the last couple of years here. So thank you so much again for sharing. We'll now be turning over to Dr. Jeffrey Pollack, Professor of Management, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Department, Poole College of Management at NC State University. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I appreciate you being here. Thanks to the Kauffman Foundation. And it's been wonderful to see all the presenters and what has been happening with the grants over the last couple of years. So what you should see on the screen right now is the number 10 on my top 10 list that I'm going to share with you over the next 10 minutes of what you should know about this grant. So number 10, we developed a website called networkimpact.io. And it was designed to measure engagement and embeddedness of entrepreneurs in their social networks, in their ecosystems via Gmail. So just to put this in perspective, we needed entrepreneurs over here to sign in with Gmail, so give access to their Gmail. We needed them to complete a short survey. And then while they're completing the survey, our program and analytics behind the scenes computed both visual and numeric representations of their engagement and embeddedness via Gmail data. So we got tens of millions of data points here, which was expensive and time consuming, and it took a lot of time to set this up. More on that later. So to make a long story short, what we enabled folks to do is visualize their network via Gmail, and where we ran into trouble, as you might imagine, is getting them to give us access to Gmail. So we thought, no problem, we'll go visit entrepreneurs, we'll go talk to them in person, we'll sit with them while they sign up on their computer. But then the COVID-19 pandemic happened and we weren't quite able to do that. And so I'll share a little bit more about that with you, but that is the general overview. Point number 10 is we set up the website. Point number 9 on the top 10 list is that the team really made this happen. We put together a list of distinguished entrepreneurs, practitioners from all over the country. Our aim was to roll this out in Raleigh. We aimed to roll it out in Stillwater, Oklahoma, Greenville, Chicago, and elsewhere. And so we really had the team in place that we wanted to make this happen. And so that is something that I'd like to acknowledge and just say I appreciate the team making this happen. In the chat, as you'll see, I posted this website as well as a link to the first paper that emerged from these data. And so if you want to go to this after the presentations, you can just bookmark those links. So point number 8, the biggest obstacle was receiving Google authorization permission. So the the point at which we applied for this grant, we had wanted to get data from Facebook, LinkedIn, Gmail, and we were awarded the grant, and there was a huge privacy debacle and data breach. Facebook shut down, no access. Twitter, same thing, shut down, no access. Google said, you can have access, but it's going to take you 6 months and $100,000 to do it. We said, okay, let's go ahead and do that. Little did we know how complicated it would be. So the Google authorization process was tedious, time-consuming, and very expensive, but we made it through that process, which enabled our interface to gather Gmail data. And we weren't actually getting any snippets of data regarding the message or the regarding line. We were only getting the email address of the to, the from, and the timestamp. So we could match up who the people were emailing and who were emailing them. So we weren't actually getting any crazy data from Gmails, but we still had to go through this process. And that was big hurdle number one. And then point number 7 is big obstacle number 2 is the COVID-19. So we had a very, very rigorous and aggressive rollout of this plan across multiple regions, where we would have someone embedded in an ecosystem. They would be there for 6 months, and they would be enrolling people on this platform. That all got canceled. And so we had to switch our recruitment strategy to only online recruitment of entrepreneurs. And as you might imagine, it's difficult to get someone to say yes to giving their Gmail information to you, even if it's just sent to and timestamp via Gmail, relative to if you're sitting there in person with them having a cup of coffee, telling them about what you're going to do and why it's going to be important. So that was a big obstacle. So related to that, I'm going to stop sharing here. So related to that, one of the biggest things that will probably come from this project is a publication that is led by Elizabeth Tracy, who's a doctoral student in IO psychology here at NC State, which focused on the recruitment strategies for enabling entrepreneurs to participate in academic research during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the link here to the Social Science Research Network is there, and it's been now published in Journal of Business Venturing Insights. Basically, what we found is that we were going to visit all these entrepreneurs in person, and that couldn't happen. So we had to figure out what exactly the best recruitment message sent via email to entrepreneurs was. And so we took the behavioral insights literature, merged it with the entrepreneurship literature to develop 5 different recruitment messages. And we randomly assigned those across about 1,500 of our sample entrepreneurs. And basically what we found is that the most effective recruitment message, literally the wording in the message, was based in the descriptive norms literature. And that is basically, if we said 50 entrepreneurs like yourself have signed up to do networkimpact.io, will you please join us? That message was the most effective way to frame our ask of these entrepreneurs, to the tune of about 5% on average conversion rate of people clicking on the link to participate in our survey. Now, that didn't mean that they necessarily followed through and did both the Gmail login as well as the short survey, but they clicked on the link. And so we're getting about 5%. So we said, okay, 5%, that's great. If we get 5% of 10 or 15,000 people who were reaching out to it, that would be great. But it was a 2-stage process. They needed to both click on it, sign up, and do the short survey. And so we ran into some issues regarding that. So in terms of what we know from the data so far, in that published manuscript, is that descriptive norms were the most useful message. In terms of that wasn't exactly what we set out to do. We set out to, as you know, measure entrepreneurs' engagement and embeddedness. What we know about engagement and embeddedness is as follows. Number 1, we know that objective measures of engagement and embeddedness that we got from Gmail were predictive, significantly, of entrepreneurs' subjective measures of performance. So how well are you doing? How well are you doing compared to your competitors? And what was your self-reported revenue over the last year? So objective Gmail data predict subjective performance. Objective Gmail data did not predict objective data that we got regarding their revenue. And so objective predicts subjective, which is in and of itself interesting, because the main thing that we know is that social ties buffer the negative impacts of economic stress on entrepreneurs. I've published a paper on that back in 2012. And so in terms of the next steps that we're going to take with this particular line of research, we need to do this longitudinally, which is going to entail us taking more time and getting more money to do this, but we need to do it longitudinally over a longer period of time, because a snapshot of someone's Gmail over the course of the last 6 months may not be representative of what's going on over the course of the following 6 months. And so we almost had a natural field experiment here, a natural quasi-experiment with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic and people's Gmail use before and after, and engagement scores before and after, which is something that we're in the process of looking at as papers emerge from these. So number three, top point number three, we need interventions to figure out if someone is low in engagement and low in embeddedness, what can we do about it? And so growth mindsets are going to be useful here. What can we do to enable these individuals to feel that social network embeddedness engagement is something that they can change? That is something that we need to work out in interventions. And then the second point is that we need to use these data to replicate existing literature and findings that show that these social network engagement and embeddedness scores can buffer the negative impacts of COVID and economic stress on their well-being. And then the number one point from this is that we're going to write a methodological brief. It's in process, being submitted to Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, that outlines all of the things that we learned, all of the things that we would have done differently, and all the things that we now will do differently in the future regarding how to study entrepreneurs' engagement and embeddedness via Gmail data. Appreciate your time. Email me or call me with any questions. And thanks to the moderators for keeping us on track.
Thank you so much. Very interesting, and I really appreciate the openness about the challenges caused as a result of the pandemic and everything you and your team did to overcome that, and the direction. I think there's a lot of good insights there in terms of thinking about overcoming projects and still staying online with the goals of that work. So next we turn to Dr. Chin Yu, Assistant Professor of Finance at Lehigh University.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and special thanks to the Foundation for the generous support to our research. So in this project, we're going to study the entrepreneurial finance of fintech firms and the effects of fintech investment on their corporate investors. I'm the principal investigator, Chen Yu from Lehigh University. Other co-investigators also include Tom Cheminer from Boston College, Michael Emerman from Claremont Graduate University, and Harshit Rajaya from the University of Ottawa. So the motivation of our project stem from the recent trends in the industry. The fintech technology, financial technology or fintech, is one of the fastest growing sectors of the last decade. For information, the total funding raised by fintech firms was slightly over $1 billion in 2010, but it rose to around $40 billion in 2018. And today we're witnessing an increasing number of investment in the fintech firms made by large established public companies in the US, in addition to venture capitalists or other private investors who traditionally invest in technology startups. For example, in 2018, US banks invested in 45 funding rounds of fintech companies, and in many cases, banks make direct investment in such firms and not through their investment arms, suggesting some degree of future proofing on their part. In addition, non-financial services companies like Amazon and IBM have also invested in fintech companies. For example, Amazon invested in the payment company Bill Me Later, which was later acquired by PayPal in 2008. So the above facts lead to the following questions. First off, do fintech startups benefit from the corporate investment for their future success? And secondly, what motivates public companies to invest in fintech startups? And does fintech investment help public companies to improve their future performance? Or is it just another type of empire building exercises made by the top management of these public companies? So in this study, we address the above research questions empirically, making use of multiple databases such as Venture Scanner, National Establishment Time Series Database, or NETS, Crunchbase, CompuStat, and CRISP. Again, we'd like to thank the generous support by the Foundation, which allow us to gain access to some of these databases. And we analyze the impact of corporate investment in fintech firms on their future performance, including successful exits measured by either going public or being acquired by another company, their innovation output, and inflow of talent. By talent, we focus on inventors or scientists or engineers. And fintech firms in our study refer to startups which are non-traditional financial intermediaries that offer financial services and products such as peer-to-peer lending, robo-advisory, insurance technology, and other services to their customers. We, on the other hand, also analyze the impact of such fintech investment on the future performance of corporate investors, including their profitability, innovation output, inventor inflow, and market share. For the interest of time, let me give you a brief overview of our findings. So we find that the presence of corporate investors is associated with a greater likelihood of successful exit of these fintech startups. We also find that corporate investment has a positive and significant impact on the quantity and quality of their future innovation output produced by these fintech firms as measured by the patenting metrics. And in addition, we find that corporate investment in these fintech startups is associated with a greater net inflow of inventors and also of high quality inventors. And then we shift our focus to the impact of fintech investment on the performance of the corporate investors, in addition to any impact on the investees. So we find that on average, there is no significant impact of fintech investment on the subsequent profitability, innovation output, talent inflows, or market shares for their corporate investors. However, when we compare corporate investors in the financial service sector versus those in the non-financial service sectors, we find that fintech investment increases the profitability, innovation output, inventor inflow, and market share of sales for financial services firms, but has no positive or even negative impact for the corporate investors in the non-financial service sector. And in addition, we also track the further investment made by corporate investors following their fintech investment. In general, we do not find that corporate investors increase their investment expenditures following their fintech investment. However, compared to non-financial services firms, we find that corporate investors in financial service sector do increase their investment expenditures after making fintech investment. So in summary, our results suggest that financial services companies are able to benefit from their fintech investment, since they have greater potential to achieve synergies from making such fintech investment, possibly due to the proximity in terms of knowledge or technology or other prior related experience. Our evidence also suggests that fintech investment made by non-financial services firms may be subject to agency costs. So some brief information about data and sample. We collect data and build our sample from multiple databases. We identify the list of fintech firms from Venture Scanner over 2000 to 2018. Then we obtain information on sales and employment information about these private startups from the NEST database. We also collect information on venture capital investment from Venture Expert and other information on startups from Crunchbase. We also utilize the patents database from the USPTO website. Also use information about public corporate investors from CRIS and CompuStat. So let me show you a couple of empirical results on both sides, on the investee side and as well as on the investor side. So in this table, we present the results on the impact of corporate investment on the probability of fintech firms' successful exits. To achieve this, we conduct firm level regression. The dependent variable is an indicator variable for IPO or acquisition or either one. And the main independent variable of interest is an indicator variable indicating there's a corporate investor making investment. We control for VC investment, age of the private startup, sales of the fintech startup. We also control for industry fixed effect and year fixed effect. So what we find here is the main variable of interest, the corporate dummy, has a positive and significant coefficient, suggesting that having a corporate investor is associated with a greater probability of fintech firms' successful exit. Then we look at the impacts of having a corporate investor on the future innovation output. To do this, we built a firm investment round panel for our analysis. This allows us to include firm fixed effect so that we can control for any potential impact of unobservable firm level characteristics that may affect innovation output. And again, we find that the corporate investors are associated with a higher likelihood with a more and higher quality innovation output for the fintech startups. And then we shift our focus to the impact of fintech investment on the performance of corporate investors who make the fintech investment. So here we built a firm quarter panel data set so that we can conduct a quasi-definitive regressions. So the main variable, the main independent variable of interest is a post-dummy indicating quarters after the corporate investor making the fintech investment. And another variable of interest is financial services indicating that the corporate investor is actually in the financial service sector. So in this table, the dependent variable is profitability as measured by ROA. In column 1, we do not find a significant impact of fintech investment on the ROA of the corporate investor in the near future. However, when we conduct the interaction test in column 2, we find that the interaction term actually carries a positive and significant coefficient, suggesting that compared to non-financial service firms, corporate investors in the financial service sector are able to increase their profitability after making the fintech investment. And similarly, we conduct panel, we use the same firm quarter panel regression to see how how fintech investments can affect the innovation output for corporate investors. In general, on average, we find no significant impact of fintech investment on the innovation output for the corporate investors. However, in column 2 and column 4, when we conduct, when we include interaction term, we find that corporate investors in the financial services sector actually increase their innovation output after making the fintech investment. Again, we include firm fixed effect and year by quarter fixed effect to absorb any potential impacts from unobservable firm level characteristics and time trends that may affect the outcome variable. So to conclude, in this study, we investigate impact of fintech investment made by corporate investors on the future performance of fintech firms. We find the fintech firms achieve a greater likelihood of successful exit, greater innovation output, and greater net inflow of inventors when there is a corporate investor making the investment. And in addition, we also investigate impacts of fintech investment on the performance of corporate investors. We find that compared to non-financial services counterparts, corporate investors in the financial service sectors are able to benefit from their fintech investments, most likely due to their great potential to achieve synergies from such fintech investment. And that's why we observe better future operating performance, greater innovation outflow, greater innovation output, and greater net inflow of inventors. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think increasingly fintech is an emerging topic in terms of importance in today's landscape, and findings are very relevant in terms of for several different audiences there. So appreciate the insights. And last but not least, certainly we have our last presenter of this series of presentations, and I'd like to turn it over to John Zeisman, Professor Emeritus, co-founder BRI, Berkeley Roundtable on International Economy, research lead at Citrus, Center for Information Technology and the Interests of Society.
Well, first of all, I should say, Derek, being a Z, I'm used to coming last. And it has its benefits, which is that I had a chance to really hear these really excellent and fascinating presentations and try and adapt my presentation at the end to that. As you will all see, we used our funds from the Kauffman Foundation for a set of specific projects, not one particular project. So what I'm going to do is walk you through what the BRI Citrus team is, what our work is, and what our plans going forward are. And we look forward to conversations and discussions about both your work and our work over the next period. The team, in fact, is highly interdisciplinary, social science, economics, technology, with business experience, policy experience, and program leadership. Let me just mention the folks in this. Jennifer Granholm, a lawyer, was a professor at Berkeley as in between her gig as governor of Michigan and Secretary of Energy. Martin Kenny, who's on the call here, is co-director at BRI, a sociologist and one of the editors at Research Policy. Mark Nitzberg, who is the executive director of the Center for Human Adapted Artificial Intelligence, is a serial entrepreneur with a PhD in mathematics. And I should say he did build one fintech, so I'm sure that he'll be very interested in the work going on. Kostas Spanos, who is director at Citrus, is a semiconductor engineer. Laura Tyson, who many of you may know, was head of the Clinton National Economic Council, dean of the Haas and London Business Schools, myself, and the illustrious Daphne Beerson, who was our remarkable research staff person who was made possible by the funding from Kauffman and has now deserted us to go to graduate school at the Harvard Business School, the PhD program. BRI is the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, which got started in the middle of the US-Japan trade wars back when, and we've been following technology and its policy implications for many years. Citrus, where we are now embedded administratively, is a UC system-wide center focused on the uses of information technology in the interests of society. And during the grant, we have built collaborations with a series of other institutes, collaborations both for research and for funding, the Institute on the Finnish Economy, 3 German institutes who have a particular interest in labor issues, Haas and Ripple, who helped fund part of the work we did in the end on Libra, and a University of California system-wide project on agriculture. Our own concerns were in how do we move toward an inclusive, equitable economy and society, and how do we follow the digital trajectory along that route? We see or broke our thinking, though not necessarily all the work, along these lines. That the underpinning, of course, of the digital era has been semiconductors and microprocessors. The intelligent tools and systems, because it's not one particular tool. One day it's robotics, everybody's worried about. The next day it's AI. It's a tool set that in fact sweeps across both manufacturing and services. And above all, platforms, which we see, and my colleague Martin Kenny emphasizes, is an organizing principle of the 21st century economy in the same way that the factory was an organizing principle of the 19th century industrial revolution. And platforms go well beyond the issue of whether they're sharing, whether there's a gig economy, to the broad transformation of the economy. And we then have taken a look at the way in which those developments have affected employment, both through platforms, some of the papers we've done on platforms, and the impact of AI, where my colleague Laura Tyson has remarked that the classic routine bias technological change, which has bifurcated much of the workforce in many ways between a high end and a low end, eroding the middle. The AI is essentially RBTC on steroids, focusing on platform-dependent entrepreneurs, work that Martin Kenny has done, that in fact, do you exist as a company if you don't have a place on Google Maps or in the platform world? And in fact, can you survive the policies and the terms and conditions laid out by the mega platforms? The changing logic of entrepreneurial finance, where we've argued that they're not only unicorns, but they're Cheshire cats. The Cheshire cats are those companies where the only thing left is the smile of the early investors, who've left with their gains. And we've done work on sector-specific issues. A closer look at this trajectory, on platforms, we've tried to go from discovery, the rise of the platform economy, how it came to really be recognized as a major innovation, to now the fears and concerns. You can see the set of papers at this website. In a real sense, the socio-political response to the maturation of the platform economy has been in a way, step now increasingly beyond competition policy, which is not adequate for something that moves as quickly as the platform world, toward prior regulation of the data of AI, both of which are critical to platforms and of platforms themselves. We've been looking carefully at the intelligent tools and systems, coming to with the question of what the impact will be, saying there will be jobs, but will there be good jobs? And that's a paper that Laura Tyson and I have done that'll be out in Daedalus in the spring. We've done work on the semiconductor challenge, both domestic, coming to the conclusion that we need to put great emphasis on the move from laboratory experimentation to fabrication. And the only way of doing that is going to be through international alliances. That AI is the narrow applications are the critical, the critical issue, not the general fears of AI. And we've tried to focus on the impacts of these, looking at market regulation, as I mentioned, on entrepreneurship, the impact of dependent entrepreneurs and of finance, where the move toward platforms and the huge move toward winner-take-all strategies oftentimes means that the companies don't invest in their own underpinnings and in the necessary support for their workforces. And recently on digital agriculture and the like. The work is published in a whole variety of places in the popular press, in management journals, in social science journals, and some of it's still under review. Now, one of the things that Kauffman had urged on us was to make sure that our work was policy relevant and engaged. And so I should just give you a sense that we've been having ongoing conversation on all these issues with policymakers in Europe and the United States, past and present. Research conferences, which we've organized or organized with others, the German conferences on platforms, employment, and post-COVID work with funding from the German Ministry of Labor, a conference on fintech and the future of payments. As you can see, we have a real interest in Tianxian's area, which was sparked by concerns by Barry Eichengreen, who some of you may know, and about the impact of Libra and what some of the cryptocurrency issues will be. There have been a series of practitioner conferences where the work we've been doing on platforms and agriculture is being discussed in by the international set of public development banks. And as another example, the work we've been doing on semiconductors, we did with the Wilson Center in Washington in the conference, The Chips Are Down. So what we intend to do is to continue the existing work in each of the trajectory categories. For example, paying attention to debates on regulation and governmental control of AI and platforms here and abroad. How do you preserve innovation and entrepreneurship while at the same time containing platform power? And try and develop and expand the collaborations to deepen the research impact. And we will focus even more on sectoral work going forward and on entrepreneurship issues. With that, let me simply say thank you to the Kauffman Foundation and frankly to Derek Oskal. It's been a pleasure working with over the years. So thank you from Bree and Citrus to Kauffman.
Thank you as always, John. Really appreciate hearing the high level view of the impact and scope of all of the work you're doing. Thank you for joining our platform to talk about platforms. We have these forums every month, and this one's certainly a little unique in the chance that we had an opportunity to hear from some of the cohort from 2018, but there's more work than what we even had a chance to hear today. And certainly with only 10 minutes per project, we didn't get to hear all of the details about the work that's going on, even in the presentations today. So, but I want to thank all of the presenters again so much for sharing about their work, and encourage everyone in the audience to follow up on the links that you see in the chat, or to reach out and learn more about the work as well that you heard today. The hope of this is certainly that we're able to have better answers to the problems and questions that entrepreneurs face, and to better understand how best to support entrepreneurs along their journey. So thank you again for everyone for attending, and please continue to join us at our monthly forums in December. You can find a link in the chat here, and you can also check out previous forums on a variety of topics on our website as well. The videos for past presentations are there. So thank you everyone again, and have a great day.